In this lecture, we're going to talk about the Palestinian question. The fundamental conflict between Israelis and Palestinians comes down to one question: who owns the land? Both sides claim a right to the region by ancient heritage, and both view the other side as trespassers. The question is, in one sense, simple, yet it's enormously complex to solve because both sides appear intractable. To an Israeli observer, you might ask, how can peace be achieved? And they'll say, simple. The Palestinians need to recognize Israel's right to exist, which they do not. Until they do that, peace is impossible because you can't negotiate with somebody who thinks you should be wiped off the map. To a Palestinian or Palestinian supporter, they would argue that Israelis have engaged in a long-term illegal land grab, and just because they've perpetuated their existence and they've been there for decades doesn't make it any more legal. Both sides, although this is an extreme version, but largely both sides view themselves as completely morally justified. So as you can see, they have vested interests and it's very hard to resolve it. After this lecture, you'll understand why many Israelis and Palestinians are committed to claiming the land as theirs, even to the point of death. In one sense, the struggle is modern, as we saw in previous lectures with the formation of the State of Israel, but in other senses, it's ancient, based on the historical claims that both sides have to this land. It's an existential battle between two groups that's lasted between 60 or 4,000 years, depending on how we define these groups. So you can see to the left there is a map of Israel. Numerous attempts have been at peace between the two sides have failed, though they were supported and even brokered by American presidents going back to Harry Truman. On the other hand, the conflict is easy to understand if we just boil it down to land. And in terms of that, here's where the ancient versus modern dynamic comes in. Many Israelis would connect themselves to the Jews of the Old Testament and, as the Jewish calendar reflects, a very ancient people. Palestinians, the name Palestine comes from Philistine, which was what the Romans named the province after Jews were expelled from it in the Bar Kokhba revolt. So there are, on the Palestinian side, some would also claim that they have a historical connection to this land that extends far back, much further back from the Jews, particularly if you consider the modern nation of Israel and most of its inhabitants only really arriving in the late 19th and early 20th century. Both Palestinians and Jews believe modern geographical Israel to be rightfully theirs, and both claim history as their arbiter. Each group traces their proposed rights to their family connection with Abraham. Religious Jews claim that they are the sons of Isaac, Abraham's designated heir. Meanwhile, pious Muslims say that Abraham's oldest son, Ishmael, was the true inheritor of Abraham's land and possession. This really boils down to a theological difference and difference in holy books between Judaism and Islam. In the Old Testament, the three patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Isaac is the designated son and the one whom receives Abraham's blessing. However, in the Quran, Ishmael, Isaac's brother and Abraham's other son, is designated as the one who will receive his blessing and is the conduit of monotheism and the line of prophets that goes down to Muhammad. So there's theological differences with this as well, but it still has bearing today. For example, the Palestinians made the case to the United Nations to reobtain their homes and land from which they'd been evicted following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, based exactly on this precedent. They argued before the United Nations that we are the descendants of Abraham and the Jews are not. So theology doesn't always stay within the realm of theology, but trickles into politics. So yes, it's about land, but there's also religion that heavily filters into this discussion. There you can see on a map is Palestine in 1020 BC. In the time of Saul, in the Old Testament, the kings of Israel, Saul, David, Solomon, and others throughout the centuries up into the first captivity by the Assyrian Empire. They're frequently contending in warfare with the Philistines, which were a seafaring Mediterranean people that were part of the wider Mediterranean Bronze Age economy, and the early Iron Age as well. The connection between them and the Palestinians is rather dubious, as well as any groups of people can be connected over the expanse of thousands of years, but history really does come into play here in terms of fashioning national identity. So let's look at the formation of Palestinians or Palestinian political groups. When hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled their homes in the 1940s and 1950s, many Middle Eastern nations worried that their plight would become deadly. So in the 1960s, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was formed in Egypt. The PLO was designed as a political support mechanism for Palestinians to aid them in their ultimate objective of completely destroying Israel, a goal that was explicitly written in the original PLO charter. Although Yasser Arafat promised that the statement would be removed after a 1993 peace agreement, it remains in the charter to this day. And you can think of it symbolically. It's like a banner that expresses entrenched resentment Palestinians feel toward the establishment of the Israeli state. It's not, when I say I want to wipe Israel off the map, it's not framed purely in terms of genocide, but the idea that amongst Palestinians, the Israeli state itself is the source of these problems. It was illegitimately created. It entrenches these unrightful land grabs. So as long as its existence continues, this injustice will continue. But to an Israeli, they would say, well, look at any nation on earth. And yes, bad things happen in history, but any nation could have dubious claims of legitimacy. But here it is. You can't make it go away. And unless you accept its existence, there will never be peace. So in response to the broad human displacements out of their homes that have occurred, Palestinians claim a right of return, which means that first-generation refugees and their descendants have a right to the property they or their ancestors abandoned or were forced to leave during the 1948 Israeli Declaration of Independence and the 1967 Six-Day War. This is a theme that's come up a lot in the peace agreements in 1993, in 2000, the roadmap to peace, the question about the right of return. Now we're about 3 generations removed from many of these original Palestinian inhabitants living there, so how that would actually be orchestrated is very difficult. As a symbol of this sentiment for right of return, many Palestinian families keep a key to their family's home in token of the hope that one day they'll be able to return and reclaim what is rightfully theirs. Here's a picture there of a gentleman holding up a key, and this is not an uncommon sight amongst Palestinians who still have a key to their original home that they were forced to evacuate. But to this moving sentiment of wanting to return to their home, many Jews would swiftly respond with an equal level of conviction that their exact purpose in coming to the region decades ago, in the Aliyahs, to establish a Jewish homeland, was to claim what had also been rightfully theirs for thousands of years. And as a result, both view the others as trespassers who at best can be tolerated and legally accommodated. At worst, their existence is a nuisance and they have absolutely no historical right to claim that land. So as you can see, this is an issue why it's vexed foreign policy for decades. How do you solve this issue? Well, we're going to be moving out of Israel and Palestine in the next lecture, and we're going to see how events in other parts of the Middle East shape politics and how Islamic revolutions happen. So we will be looking next lecture at Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. Thank you for listening.